am a women's historian and a social historian, and if Islam comes up, well, it comes up. But if that wasn't what I was asking about today, sometimes it doesn't come up at all. And I do not make easy assumptions like Islam is somehow shaping this particular context or this particular question. And it turns out that lately, because I did this major oral history project on collectivization, and I have all of these transcripts about it, no matter what anybody asks me to talk about, what I really talk about is all of those oral histories of collectivization. So, sorry about that. That's exactly what I'm doing again today. And so rather than giving some big overview about Islam and women in all of Central Asia, which I sort of, when Sebastian contacted me and said, you know, would you be our keynote speaker? I thought, oh geez, do I have to do that? And I fully intended to try to do something like that. And then I started writing about gendered memories of Soviet times, Basmachi stories, and that's where I'm actually going today. So I hope that this will actually, through at least the theoretical stuff that I'm doing, will allow for some tie-in across all sorts of papers, even though the rest of you are not going to be talking about Basmachis or collectivization or anything else like that. So, I'll start with a couple of comments. First of all, there are these two competing narratives about what happened in the period when the Red Army was taking over Central Asia. And one of them was that, okay, so this is the old standard Soviet version. There were these militants who were basically bandits. We should call them Basmachi bandits, and they illegitimately fought against noble Soviet power that was trying to liberate everybody in Central Asia. This has been replaced more recently by a new post-Soviet narrative in especially Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, the countries that I've read about more than others, but probably elsewhere as well. In the period between 1917 and 1923 or so, Central Asians were fighting a struggle for national liberation. The leaders of this movement were called Kurbashis. They were noble self-sacrificers for the cause of the liberation of Central Asia, and they were crushed by the evil Soviets, who then imposed a totalitarian regime on everyone. So I'm giving you both of those versions in a very nutshell and not polite set of terms. And they raised questions for me. They raised questions for me about how people thought about this time period. In the early 2000s, between 2000 and 2004, I worked with a group of oral history interviewers from Tashkent. We conducted oral history interviews in 7 different provinces of Uzbekistan to ask people about their experiences of collectivization of agriculture. And as they told us their stories, we asked them about a whole lot of things, and one of the questions we asked them about was, well, what do you know about Basmachis? And this would open up their particular family stories on that theme. Now, why did I turn to that for today? On every topic that they talked about, we could ask them about, you know, what did your parents have? What did they lose when you became a member of a collective farm? We could ask them about religion. We could ask them about just about anything. And they had very different perspectives. They came from different standpoints. They articulated different narratives with different judgments. That's hardly surprising. We all can experience one set of events, and we will come away and talk about it in very different ways. Well, the same is true for a whole lot of Uzbek former collective farmers who were in their 80s in the early 2000s. So, today I want to focus very particularly on their stories about Basmachis. And in order to do that, let me give you, okay, am I talking to anybody in here who doesn't already know this history? Yes? Okay, I will give you the 2-second version of a quick history of early transformation in Central Asia. In 1917, the Bolsheviks took over power in former Russian Empire. They did not want to give up former Russian imperial territories in Central Asia. They sent soldiers to Central Asia. Those soldiers came into conflict with local people who were fighting for what they thought of as autonomy. The Soviets won. the autonomy forces were ended, and then the Soviets initiated some major forms of social transformation. One of them, in Uzbekistan, was called the Hujum, which meant the attack against the old ways, and it really featured party and government attention to women and women's actions, and the state wanted to encourage all women, all Muslim women, to unveil, to embrace all kinds of forms of Soviet modernization, go to school, get a job, etc. In the same year, the state also cracked down on Islam across the board, closing Islamic schools and arresting a lot of mullahs and Islamic leaders. And so people put these things together in their minds, aha, unveiling was anti-Islamic. In 1929, 2 years later, the Soviet state, across the board, started a policy that they called collectivization of agriculture, which meant regardless of what your former form of agricultural ownership was, you had to join together and form a collective farm. And that was the focus of our interviews in the early 2000s, what went on during that period. So here are a couple of maps. They, in the particular moment that I'm going to talk about, this Kurbashi, or shall we call them Basmachis, were formed because there was a little autonomy movement in Turkestan, Russian Turkestan, they got together at the city of Kokand. They called themselves the Kokand Autonomy. They tried to establish what they thought of as an autonomous government, and they were crushed within 2 months. This did not last long. But the military force that was assembled at Kokand was led by commanders who had the title Kurbashi. The Kurbashis were dispersed, and they kept up their fight. They kept trying to fight against the new Soviet power, and they continued that at a fairly large scale until 1923, and a much smaller scale up into the 1930s. So when we were talking with elderly people about Basmachis or Kurbashis, they responded by talking about the actions of these folks and anybody else who carried out any kind of violent raid on society anytime between the early 1920s and the mid-1930s. Okay, so there's a little historical background. This is the Uzbek SSR in 1925. It was created, those are the borders as they were created in 1925, which is always fun to show people because if you know today's Uzbekistan, it doesn't look like this. So let me turn to my core theory here, which is about feminist standpoint theory. Okay, back in the early 90s, when I did a project interviewing elderly Uzbek women about the Unveiling campaign, I was drawing on feminist standpoint theory. So what is feminist standpoint theory? Well, in Susan Heckman's quick definition, it seeks to answer one of the fundamental propositions of feminist analysis. How do we justify the truth of the feminist claim that women have been and are oppressed? How do we do that? Standpoint theorists pointed out that knowledge is situated and perspectival, and there are multiple standpoints from which knowledge is produced. Nancy Hartsock and other early feminist standpoint theorists were hoping to reveal structures of patriarchy through a focus on women's everyday realities, revealing an objectively superior knowledge that is somehow less biased and more comprehensive. That feminist standpoint theory thesis was eclipsed by third-wave feminism and intersectionality, which drew attention to an even greater diversity of gendered experiences and called for research and analysis that takes into consideration class, race, gender, ethnicity, religion, etc., and any identities or positions that marginalize individuals and groups. Both the standpoint theorists and the intersectionality theorists posited that listening to the voices of the marginalized will allow us to challenge hegemonic narratives. And this is a discourse that comes up with the feminist theory people and the intersectionality theory people all the time, challenging hegemonic narratives. So, third-wave feminists then attacked earlier feminists, noting that feminism itself can be a hegemonic narrative, sometimes even the handmaiden of colonialism. So when I was carrying out interviews for the project on unveiling, I was thinking of the hegemonic narrative as the Soviet version. And this is a version of history that has a particular establishment within archival documents and within all of the history writing of the Soviet period. And that hegemonic version of the hujum in particular was that Central Asian women were backward, and the Communist Party liberated them from ignorance and from the oppression of Islam. The other form of the hegemonic narrative that was dominant in the West at the time, and actually was dominant among Central Asian exiles as well, was that Soviet rule destroyed Islamic society in Central Asia, forced all women to do things that they would not have wanted to do, such as unveiling and working outside of the home, and had its logical consequence because this was the late 1980s, the 1980s wave of self-immolations by women. So, when I started this research, I had access to two competing hegemonic narratives told in different places about a particular time, and of course when I did the interviews, everything turns out to be more complex, which is what historians always say. And it's more complex than that. Stories that women told me about were about their own actions and their own concerns, and about Soviet opportunities, about what unveiling did for them, and so forth. They didn't dispute a Soviet narrative of progress. But they parted ways with the Soviet narrative by leaving out the framing in which the party initiated every change and deserved thanks or credit. They didn't support the Western Cold Warrior hegemonic narrative of oppression. To the extent that they told me any stories of resistance at all, they were stories of resistance against patriarchal domination. For them, the women that I talked to, throwing off the veil, whether they did it because they wanted to or because someone forced them to, initially exposed them to harassment in their own societies, but in the long run was nothing any single one of them regretted doing, which was fascinating to me. For myself, as an advocate of feminist standpoint theory, this finding was very convenient. My less biased, more comprehensive research offered a corrective, emphasizing women's agency that in enacting changes that contributed to some liberatory trends. And for me, feminism is about liberation. It's not so when I talk about liberatory trends, what I mean is the stories that women told me about their lives in the 1920s were that these changes did not just serve their own little narrow interests, but actually opened up opportunities more broadly for women. So they were liberatory in their implications. So other scholars who have studied the hujum offer quite a different analysis, and that is that the unveiling campaign was Soviet colonialism. It was forced on Central Asians, and I find that analysis to be limited or wrong in that you can only really adhere to it if you completely ignore the standpoints of the actual women who went through it. So, nicely, standpoint theory did not contradict my feminism. Yay for me, right? Okay, but what if listening to a whole lot of standpoints doesn't actually result in challenging hegemonic narratives or supporting my feminist thoughts? As Susan Heckman pointed out in her critique of feminist theory, standpoint theory that is, Foucault would counter that all knowledge is necessarily from some perspective. Everyone has a standpoint. In our interviews that we conducted in 7 different provinces in Uzbekistan, so these different places, and in most places about 20 interviews with people who were born somewhere between 1902 and 1925. Those included 102 men and 38 women. Is that right? No, 28 women. 102 men and 28 women. So in these, everyone had a standpoint. Everybody had a perspective. Children of the rich had theirs. Children of the poor who willingly joined the kolkhoz had theirs. Women who had mainly spent their time being housewives had their perspectives, and women who had joined the kolkhoz leadership, they had their perspectives. Great, everybody has a standpoint. And in fact, many of them claimed marginalization at some point in their past. Either they were orphans and they eventually got a better life, or they were poor and had been oppressed by the rich, or they were rich or wealthy or happy and doing just fine and then the Soviets oppressed them, or they were wrongly accused of something and they were unjustly arrested or dispossessed, right? So, and an external view might be that all of their voices are the voices of the marginalized because they were all rural people, they were all farmers, and nobody had ever paid attention to a darn thing they ever said before. Great. So I can't easily categorize any of them as the marginalized, whose voices, as a standpoint theorist, I'm supposed to be representing. And I can't actually easily extract any feminist meaning out of anything that they say. And an intersectional analysis doesn't support any particular notion of a liberatory trend either. I'm stuck. Okay. Until I came to this paper, which allows me to come back to my feminist theory, maybe. Okay. In looking at I decided to take a look at all of my transcripts and see, okay, are there ways that women's narratives about this time in their past, the 1920s and the 1930s, differ from men's narratives? What really amazed me is that when they were talking about things like how we joined the collective farm, or what my parents had, or whether we lost something, or whether we were dekulakized, or something like that, men and women told the same stories. They did not have sharply different perspectives at all. So that was for most of the things that we talked about. Where did they ever come up with different perspectives? One was when we asked them a question about basmachis, and that's what I'll talk about here, that evidence. A second one was the stuff they brought up voluntarily. We didn't ask anything about World War II. Men, almost all of whom were veterans of World War II, voluntarily brought up World War II all the time. Women, we didn't ask anything about what age did you get married or how many children did you have. They brought that stuff up voluntarily, and interestingly, men would talk about, I had 5 children. Women would say, I had 8 children, 3 of them died, and 4 of them lived. So they would pay attention to that so there were, in fact, these moments where women were focusing on their experience as women, and men were focusing on their experience as men. Okay, the part that I want to talk about, though, are these basmachi stories. So, skip a couple pages here. I mentioned these 2 different narratives. One is a the Soviet version, which was popularized in film and told all the time and became very, very stereotypical. No, there is nothing noble about these groups from the early 1920s. They're not Kourbashis, noble commanders. No, they were basmachis, raiders. And I use this, Uzbeks use the word basmachi, but they spell it with an O instead. And in the Soviet version, the Red Army protected poor Central Asians from the depredations of these bandits. In the post-Soviet retellings, there are no basmachis, let's not even talk about that. There were Kourbashis. They were noble strugglers for national liberation, and they were crushed by the Red Army. And the Red Army preyed on Central Asians, not other Central Asians. So our interviews with elderly collective farmers, the majority, and these are people who experienced basmachi raids as victims. Most of them said basmachis were raiders and bandits, and they continued their attacks until the 1930s. A minority of them said, no, not basmachis, Kourbashis. They were struggling for power against the Soviets. And the women had different accounts than the men. The women's accounts were entirely focused on gendered violence. So, I'm going to start with a few of these stories. Hidayat was raised by her mother, who became an activist with the Women's Division after her husband abandoned her. Hidayat joined the Komsomol, and she went with a group of Komsomol activists to a village to agitate for collectivization. This is a woman who was so on the side of the Soviet state, she really was. And she said, on the way back, there were basmachis. By that time, this is the early 1930s, we weren't afraid of basmachis, so we said, we'll return at night. But the basmachis shot at us, shot after our cart. We got covered with the horse's blood, and we all jumped into a ditch. So she was referring to people who violently opposed collectivization as basmachis. And she said that when there was dekulakization, that means a process of dispossessing the wealthy of their lands and redistributing them to the poor and then turning them all into a collective farm, she said the basmachi movement really strengthened. It got so bad you couldn't even go out in the streets because there was crossfire. The sons of the rich men were shooting. It was a real hubbub. Hidayat's description of basmachis was consistent with our other accounts. Many people said they were the sons of the wealthy, they opposed something that the Soviet government was doing, and they were violent. But she pointed out then that the effects of this violence lingered. She said, the basmachi have all died, but sometimes when I go to feasts, there are still a few old women who sit there weeping, old women who were carried off by the basmachis. They sit there saying, we saw them from behind the curtains, we saw their feasting, and they carried us off. Kumar Nisa recalled that the basmachis when we asked her when Russians first came to her village. She said, oh, the Russians came, and for what? Oh dear, it was because of the basmachis, to chase them. The basmachis would come here and seize things. They carried off beautiful young girls and good women to uninhabited places. Later in the interviewer returned to the topic of basmachis, and she posed, or he, I can't remember who was doing the interview, posed the questions in a way that seemed to push Kumar Nisa to see the Kurbashis as nobly struggling against Russian depredations. The interviewer asked whether, when the Russians came hunting basmachis, didn't the Russians themselves invade people's houses and make demands? No, answered Kumar Nisa. They didn't do those things, but the Kurbashi did. Umar Nisa was old enough to remember the basmachis in her own neighborhood. She called them Beks. Madamin Bek came from her neighborhood. He was the head Kurbashi of the early Kurbashi movement. She noted that her mother was acquainted with them, and in her story, the Beks, the basmachi, were fighting against the Red Militia, and her family was afraid. She said, my uncle said to my mother that they would kidnap her, so she should hide under a flower bush. But then someone else in the house pointed out that the basmachis had guns and they might shoot at that bush. So instead, this is Umar Nisa, and her mother hid in the house. While I was lying beside my mom, two of them, the basmachis, leaned against the door of the house and shot at that bush. Her grandfather and maternal uncle tried to appease some basmachis by offering them bread. My mother was very beautiful, and she had daughters, and Umar Nisa's grandmother convinced them, that is, mother and daughters, to go up on the rooftop and sleep there, thinking that thus they would be hid from a basmachi attack. They heard basmachis coming through their neighborhood, and in the dark, her mother fell from the roof, had her fall broken by a poplar tree, wound up with broken bones, and after that walked with a limp. These are very, very concrete memories of a very particular individual occurrence in the past. She noted that basmachis were not only after girls, but that they also seized young boys. Others from the Margalan region also had personal and family stories about the basmachis. Ogul Khan said that when she was a young girl, she was very fearful of them, but her atin, her female religious teacher, taught her to recite a certain Quranic prayer, which she said would keep them away. Nevertheless, the basmachis actually did kidnap two of Ogul Khan's sisters and took them away. Ogul Khan's son wanted his mother to differentiate between the Kurbashi, such as Madamin Bek from their neighborhood, whose actions he saw as legitimate, and the basmachi who raided and carried off girls. But Ogul Khan remembered them all as the same sort of kidnapping bandits. Halima Khan remembered sleeping on the roof out of fear of a basmachi attack, and she said, we put chains on the children's legs to thwart kidnapping. Narzi recalled that basmachi were still active in her Bukhara region in the mid-1930s. After the kolkhoz formed, one person in our village was a big man with the basmachis, and they came and they murdered the kolkhoz director. Other than that, the basmachis went to houses and made demands. They stole carpets that had come from the kolkhoz club. The basmachis carried off girls, she said, but she didn't offer any examples. A Tajik-speaking woman from Norata, whose photo I don't have, talked about local men from her village who joined the basmachis and who tried to hide from the Russians who came to find them. She said, some people who joined from here, that is, from my village, kidnapped young girls from the places where they went, and they would carry out a nikah, a religious wedding, for those men. For example, there was an old woman in our village who was kidnapped from Sental. She died recently. She was kidnapped and forcibly married here. Interestingly, this particular woman pointed out that everyone had seen these things in movies. Basmachis raided, they stole girls, and so forth. But she, like the other women of her generation who were telling these stories, wanted to insist that for her, these were not just tales. She actually knew women who were victimized by basmachis. A little later, some who were born later told the stories that came from their parents. So Akhtam said, the times were worst when the Basmachis attacked. I didn't see it because my mother was pregnant with me. When my mother was giving birth, she went to the city with me. Those Basmachis seized many good women and children. My father, fearing them, sent my mother to the city. One woman who had not yet given birth from our village had been seized. We returned 6 months later. My mother would tell me about this. I heard about it from my mother and my father's mouths. It was a bad time when people would hide their daughters underground or in other places. If they were taken, the Basmachis would keep them 10 or 20 days and then discard them. Zulaiha was old enough to remember Basmachi attacks and said that everyone from her village fled into the desert. Other respondents told stories from their mothers of fleeing from homes similar to hers. Okay. Embedded in all of these accounts are the anxieties that parents felt and impressed upon their daughters, a feeling of a specific gendered vulnerability of unmarried girls and young women. As they grew up, some of these women came to know others who were the victims of Basmachi kidnapping, who had been forcibly married and remained in the kidnappers' community. While women respondents told of Basmachis stealing and raiding, the fact that Basmachis kidnapped girls and women shaped family strategies for protecting girls by restricting their movements. It shaped how and when parents decided to arrange marriages, and it remained a topic that apparently could continue to arise at women's gatherings for decades and decades and decades when Basmachi victim brides told their own stories. These women's stories contrast with masculine ways of recounting the Basmachis. So I'm going to talk, first of all, what I want to stress here is women spoke with a gender lens. Women's embodiment, their very awareness of the possibility of kidnapping and rape, underlay their memory and their entire standpoint on this episode. And it was consistent across the board. Every woman who mentioned Basmachis mentioned kidnapping. Okay, I could talk about Abashan's particular Kurbashi, and I'll come back to him if anybody wants me to. But men's Basmachi stories. Men's accounts in our set of interviews emphasize fear of Basmachis in a different way. They focused on shootouts, on home invasion, and on the theft of goods and horses. One man here, Amin John, told stories of specific girls who had been stolen and of women in his community whom the Basmachis had kidnapped and married forcibly. So that wasn't left out of men's stories, but their stories were much broader. Men's stories included remembrances of fleeing or hiding from Basmachis by donning paranjis, by concealing themselves in the cemetery, heading into the hills to hide, hiding in a tandoor. One mentioned digging holes, hiding the children in them, and covering up the hole with blankets or ashes. Hamid told his grandmother's story. When he was a small child, his grandmother was an activist. She actually was the head of the village council, and Basmachis attacked a meeting of the village council, and she fled while the Basmachis set their house on fire and burned it down. Rustam recalled Basmachis and soldiers were fighting in his neighborhood and said, I was a small child then, and I needed to go to the toilet. My mother put an old robe over my head to protect me from the bullets. Imagine that. I went outside, saw the bullets flying, and I went back in. Hyrule remembered that when Basmachis attacked his home, his grandparents told the children to hide under a quilt. While his grandmother yelled at the Basmachis, they seized household goods, and they took the family's horse. Yildash said that the Basmachis attacked his home when his father was storing goods for the district. That's him over there. His brother took out the family gun and chased them off. Kurban, who told of a major conflict within his village, I don't have his photo up here, but he participated in an action against rich landowners, and then a group of Basmachis attacked his village, burned down his own house, seized the members of the village committee who had carried out the land reform, and murdered all of them in a mosque. One man, Ahmed, shared a much longer story of Basmachis taking young women. These armed raiders continued to attack and extract from his village near Gishtuban until the mid-1930s. They knew when weddings were planned and would arrive and extort the families, demanding either money or the bride. And he said, this is Faizi right here, I had to turn my bride over to the attackers. Faizi came from let's see, a different Faizi, no, sorry, that was Ahmed, whose picture isn't here. This is Faizi. Faizi, he was from the same region. He told of Basmachis invading his family home, beating him up as he tried to hide family valuables. And he said, I know the Basmachis, I received their blows. Haji, also from Bukhara, said that in 1932, Basmachis attacked his home and shot and killed his father. Abdul Qayyum said that Basmachis killed his grandfather in 1929. Tajibai said that Basmachis demanded his brother's horses at knife point. These, again, are extremely concrete, situated, out of personal experience stories about Basmachis. Sharafuddin, who is here, joined the militia and was involved in tracking down and killing Basmachis. Many of these men who told these Basmachi stories remembered with satisfaction the moments when Basmachis who had attacked their villages were captured and killed or put on trial. We encountered no women who had anything positive to say about Basmachis. There were men who had a very different standpoint, not of Basmachis as brutal raiders, but of Basmachis as defenders of the people, or as nobly aspiring for Islamic government, or as simply misunderstood. Orozbay, whose picture I don't have here, sadly, was involved in stealing sheep in the 1920s, and he was arrested and accused of being a Basmachi. He said, I was imprisoned in Nurata, but then they let me go because they couldn't make the case. I was exonerated. But Halil Pasha, Rasulbay, and Jabaroy were all sentenced and shot in the evening. They were Basmachis and rich men, and I was exiled. Mukim John remembered seeing Basmachis in the streets, and he recalled that people would hide their livestock and their families, but he equivocated between, in his view, not one side good, the other side bad. He said at night, Basmachis stole from people, and during the day, the Red soldiers did. There were those whose relatives had joined the Basmachis. Those people tended to emphasize that Basmachi actions were justified because Bolsheviks were oppressors. Saeed Ali Khan, here, explained that his maternal uncles were close to Madame Bek, that first Korbashi, who was notorious, and everybody knew his name, and so if you wanted to claim kin to somebody important, you would claim it to Madame Bek. But in any case, his uncles were close to Madame Bek, so when other Basmachis stole from Saeed Ali Khan's father, Saeed Ali Khan's uncles were able to negotiate the return of the stolen money using their connections with Madame Bek. However, Saeed Ali Khan's father was threatened with arrest for his associations with the Basmachis, and he went into hiding for years. Abdullah told us about a guy in his community named Mullah Mirza, who was, again, a relative by marriage to one of his aunts. Mullah Mirza joined the Basmachis, and Abdullah saw this as a very legitimate thing to do and felt sorry for Mullah Mirza because he had been forced to go into exile in Afghanistan. Qurban, this particular Qurban, was poor. His family joined the kolkhoz early. He went on to become a teacher, and he tried to give a balanced view of the Basmachi. He said that the recent historical rehabilitation as Korbashi was the right way to see them. He said, well, maybe they were forced to carry out all that extortion and theft. A person has to struggle for a living and fill his stomach. A group that Qurban identified as Kazakh Basmachis had asked permission to cross his uncle's field. But when the group came into the village, Red Army soldiers shot them, chased them out into a desert, and killed all of them. I saw this with my own eyes, said Qurban. He averred that Basmachis, or Korbashis, did not steal from or bother ordinary people. They were just opposed to Soviet power. Avez argued that those who opposed collectivization or opposed Soviet government should not be called Basmachis. He said, they judged that in collectivizing them, the state was exploiting and harming the people. Those who did not understand them called them Basmachi. But Avez noted that there had never been any Basmachi attacks in his village. Yusupai, who is right here, said that in his district, 20 or 30 men, there were 20 or 30 men who in the late 1920s tried to take land back from the Soviet government. They came chanting that God gave strength to the religion of Islam. I know that because I was playing in the streets. They hoped to develop the religion of Muslims, but the Red Army annihilated them all. This particular group's actions included killing the assistant to the district Communist Party leader, and dumping his body in a river, a story that was told to us again by another interviewee from that district. Yusufzai, though, said, yes, they attacked people like that, but they didn't attack the poor, and they were trying to build a different kind of country. Notably, Yusufzai's uncle was accused of belonging to the Basmachis, and he disappeared. One of our youngest respondents talked about Sadullah, whom he called a nimble young warrior who came from a neighboring town. He said that this young man, Sadullah, was poor but served a rich man, and he rose up in the name of Islam. They hated the Bolsheviks and fought against them. Eventually, the Red Army defeated the local Basmachis, but according to our informant, only by paying young men to fight on the government side, or they would not have gone. Okay, what do I get out of all of this? These standpoints differed quite clearly. Stories told by Uzbek kolkhoz members about Basmachis or Qurbashis fall into three groups. Women focused on the threat that raiders posed to the female body: kidnapping, rape, forced marriage. Men spoke either as victims or they spoke as defenders, the sympathizers, we might call it. Victims called the attackers Basmachi. They didn't care whether the raiders justified their actions politically or not. If they used the term Qurbashi at all, they did so interchangeably with Basmachi. Male men in our interviews who had family members who were part of these militant groups were much more likely to insist that they were Qurbashi, legitimate fighters for national liberation, and that no, they never attacked ordinary people. They focused all of their attention against against Soviet oppressors. The standpoint, in fact, matters profoundly in these narratives. Men spoke, but interestingly, not standpoint that can be sorted out by class or ethnicity or race or anything else. It's a standpoint amongst men as to whether they were victims of raiders or were not. That was how their particular views divided up. Interestingly, all of the women shared one standpoint, and it was a gender standpoint, and it was about the potential for violence against the female body. So I'm going to close there.